Dear moderator, dear speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event through this video message, and please accept my apologies for not being able to be present in person. I'm happy to offer some comments on the role of the mandate on contemporary forms of slavery in addressing caste and gender-based forced labor and bonded labor. Discrimination, social exclusion, and poverty are well-known systemic and structural causes of contemporary forms of slavery, but also perpetuate slavery and slavery-like practices such as serfdom, bonded labor, forced labor, domestic servitude, and the worst forms of child labor. In this context, caste-based discrimination as a form of discrimination based on descent needs specific focus, particularly where it also intersects with race and gender. Starting with my predecessor, Gulnara Shahinian, since 2007, the mandate has highlighted the increased vulnerability to contemporary forms of slavery of people considered to belong to lower castes. This is exacerbated when the factors of race, gender, nationality, and other pernicious grounds of discrimination intersect with caste to create a vortex of continuing economic disadvantage and political disempowerment. Caste results in stigmatization, arising from deeply rooted social customs, beliefs, rituals, and behaviors, and denies an individual's fundamental human rights. In certain parts of West Africa, caste continues to determine social status and deny access to employment, as well as rights to own land and even to choose a marriage partner. In my official visit to Niger in November last year, I addressed the issue of continued stigmatization and discrimination of people of slave descent and those from the caste associated with being slaves, for example, butchers, blacksmiths, and traditional musicians. In my end of mission statement and my forthcoming report to the Human Rights Council, I will make recommendations in this regard. In Niger, women who were former slaves and their descendants continue to suffer untold poverty as a result of their status. In Madagascar, my predecessor found that those deemed to belong to the so-called lowest caste are the most vulnerable to poverty and slavery-like practices and are also the most discriminated against. In Mauritania, a country where the mandate has been very much involved, the black Moors, known as Haratin, continue to suffer discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion due to their descent, membership of a so-called slave caste, with de facto slaves and descendants of slaves aside the lowest status in societies, and they are the ethnic group most associated with slavery and slavery-like practices. The intersection between caste and poverty in South Asia, for example, has created a dark heritage of poverty for the children enslaved in bonded labor, serfdom, and forced labor to pay off intergenerational debts. In general, those in debt bondage or bonded labor, an institution or practice similar to slavery, prohibited by the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the slave trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery of 1956, are mostly from socially excluded groups. In South Asia, bonded labor disproportionately affects people with disadvantaged social status, such as Dalits. While the exact number is unknown, research undertaken by different stakeholders, including civil society organizations, testifies as to the involvement of children, women, and men perceived as belonging to lower castes in bonded labor in agriculture, brick kilns, stone mining and quarrying, as well as the textile and garment industry. Gender inequalities and gender discrimination play an important role in contributing to women's vulnerability to contemporary forms of slavery. Women and girls believed to belong to lower castes are particularly vulnerable and exposed to multiple forms of discrimination, including on the basis of their gender and caste. In India, for example, Dalit women still have to engage in manual scavenging. Because of their caste, they are expected to take care of scraping human excrement from dry toilets in private households or public places. This practice continues despite a long-standing government campaign and the legislation prohibiting it, which testifies as to the complexity of effectively tackling such deeply rooted discrimination. The mandate has in the past focused on Nepal as an example of the continuation of caste-based discrimination resulting in bonded labor in general, but now this challenge is likely to increase following the displacement caused by the recent earthquakes. This requires increased attention and efforts to guarantee the protection of human rights, especially for women and girls. Let me now focus on how special procedures mandate holders as one of the UN human rights mechanisms can address caste and gender intersection in the area of forced and bonded labor through the main methods of their work. Firstly, through communications sent to governments. Secondly, country visits. Thirdly, thematic reports that mandate holders submit to the UN Human Rights Council or General Assembly. In my thematic report to be presented to the Council in September, I will be exploring the linkages between contemporary forms of slavery and supply chains, and will provide recommendations to that effect to different stakeholders. Lastly, through awareness raising and advocacy as a key tool. For example, in May 2013, several special rapporteurs, including the Mandate on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, issued a statement calling for strengthened protection of more than 260 million victims of caste-based discrimination. Our work as mandate holders is, of course, only one small part of the UN human rights machinery. In addition, the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other UN human rights mechanisms, i.e. human rights treaty bodies and the Universal Periodic Review, have all addressed the issue of caste-based discrimination, and the UN Voluntary Trust Fund on Contemporary Forms of Slavery has been providing support to victims, including those of caste-based slavery, through project funding since 1991. A plethora of other actors has also been involved in this endeavor. Let me just highlight the important role played by the civil society. Civil society organizations have been doing an excellent job revealing the extent of contemporary forms of slavery, including involving those from so-called lower castes, eliminating caste discrimination and providing assistance to victims. Civil society organizations have also been very active in inputting into treaty body reviews of states parties' reports, the Universal Periodic Review, and into informing the work after special procedures. There, however, is still a need for greater linkages in addressing contemporary forms of slavery within the UN system as a whole, including by the members of the UN country teams working with the affected communities on the ground and beyond it. To this effect, let me mention a couple of points that I find important. Effective and broad partnerships and targeted advocacy based on comprehensive research and reliable data aimed at addressing the root causes of contemporary slavery, such as poverty, social exclusion, and discrimination. Secondly, there's a need for a multidimensional approach, including legal, policy, and institutional measures to combat discrimination of caste-affected communities, deeply entrenched in social prejudices, value systems, customs, and beliefs, developed with the active involvement of all those concerned. Thirdly, securing rehabilitation and economic and social empowerment of those belonging to so-called lower castes, and removing barriers to their effective access and meaningful access to justice and meaningful participation in decision-making processes. Fourthly, effective implementation of the existing laws, policies, and programs aimed at guaranteeing human rights and ensuring de facto equality of those affected by caste-based discrimination, and allocation of adequate resources with the support of the international community and donor agencies if needed to tackle it effectively. Sixthly, adopting a human rights-based approach in the development programs, taking into account the specific needs of those most vulnerable to slavery and slavery-like practices, including those belonging to so-called lower castes. In addition, endorsement and implementation by the states of the UN draft principles and guidelines for the effective elimination of discrimination based on work and descent is critical. As stated in my first report to the Human Rights Council, I will continue addressing the different forms of contemporary slavery, including bonded labor and caste-based forms of slavery. Many children involved in work come from groups discriminated against and or marginalized, including those given a certain social status such as caste. Given my focus on children, especially the girl child, I would like to emphasize the need to look into the strategies to eradicate this. Next year, we are going to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the Slavery Convention and the 60th anniversary of the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery. This is yet another incentive to strengthen efforts to guarantee that everyone, including those from caste-affected communities, fully enjoy their human rights without any discrimination, including the right not to be subjected to slavery and slavery-like practices. The successful fight against stigmatization and deeply entrenched discrimination necessitates the involvement of every member of society, and this is only possible by means of broad awareness raising, increased social consciousness, and denouncing of continued discrimination based on caste, gender, and other factors that undermine human dignity and violate fundamental human rights. The events such as this one are an important part of this process. I thank you for this opportunity and I wish you a productive discussion.